St. John of the Cross is a famous discalced Carmelite priest, mystic, and doctor of the Church who lived in Spain in the 16th century. His command of the Spanish language was such that to this day his mystical poems are considered unequaled masterpieces of Spanish literature. You may know about him from prior reading you've done, or you may have heard me talk about him, which I do on occasion. If you've heard anything about St. John of the Cross, it's likely that it is his description of the dark night of the soul that you heard about. The dark night of the soul can be thought of as a journey a soul takes as it becomes more and more united to God. But the dark night is not the various difficulties we all experience. It's not the tragedies, even the heartbreaking ones that may occur in our lives. Those can indeed be dark times, but they're not the dark night in the way St. John of the Cross meant. The dark night, according to St. John, results from the inner struggle we all experience when God invites us to love, and we resist that invitation. The dark night is when God invites us to love, and we resist that invitation. The journey of the dark night itself begins when we cease to resist God's invitation to love and move more completely into union with Him. And the dark night is said to be dark because when we accept God's invitation to love, He changes us and perfects us without our necessarily perceiving how the changes and perfections take place. That's what's dark about the dark night. Now, sometimes this moving closer to God does occur during difficult circumstances, and that accounts for the former confusion. In any case, the dark night as a whole can be divided up into 4 individual nights, if you will, or ways in which God prepares our soul. The active night of sense, the passive night of sense, the active night of the Spirit, and finally the passive night of the Spirit. These aren't steps in a process, nor do they necessarily occur in that particular order, but the order in which I listed them is the one that often occurs in practice, and so I plan on covering them in that order. The fact is, though, we often pass through these active and passive nights of the sense and spirit more than once and at different times in our lives. Now, there's too much to cover in one homily, so I'll be covering the active night of sense tonight and the others in the next 2 subsequent homilies. The first night in the journey of the dark night occurs when we cooperate with God and gain control of our bodily desires and appetites. And this disposes us to union with God. We can't be united with God when we're attached to things of the earth. St. John calls this process of detachment the active night of sense, that is, as in the 5 senses. And it's active because it's something that we do. It's a deliberate act of our will. And he uses the word sense because this part of the dark night involves mortifying our bodily senses to regain control of our passions and desires, which more often than not control us rather than we controlling them. And this topic is actually quite timely because, believe it or not, Ash Wednesday begins next week. And Lent is the time when, in essence, all Catholics throughout the world are supposed to enter into the active night of sense. You see, the objective of the active night of sense is for us to take steps to correct our more obvious faults, mortify our self-centered ego, and exercise restraint with regard to our sensory pleasures. Again, it's said to be active because we take the lead, if you will. And that describes the penitential aspect of Lent pretty well, doesn't it? That is, Lent as we're taught to and supposed to observe it. The active night of sense consists of penances that are truly difficult because they're putting things back into the right order, our disordered passions and appetites, namely. And this is far and away more intense and difficult than the more typical milquetoast Lenten penances we might impose on ourselves. You know the kind I'm talking about, the one we might try to justify by saying, "But Father, you don't understand what a sacrifice it is for me to give up chocolate." I mean, really, that's just lame. Lent that truly reflects the dark night of the sense, as intended by St. John of the Cross, involves real fasting, penances, correction of faults, and acts of charity that truly cost us something. A generous giving of alms throughout the entire Lenten season, for instance, not just on Fridays. Now, we should understand that in the context of moving toward union with God, our bodily senses are loud. They not only try and distract us from the spiritual, they insist on being in control. To become sensitive to God's promptings and hear this voice, though, we need to master the disorderly senses. We need to quiet them so we can hear and be sensitive to the gentle promptings of the Holy Spirit. Remember Elijah on the mountain waiting for God? God was not in the strong driving wind, the earthquake, or the fire. He was in the gentle breeze that followed. And Elijah had to be quiet, internally and externally, to hear that breeze. But the only way to become the master of our bodily desires, to use the more traditional language, is to mortify them. That is, to deliberately deprive ourselves of pleasures that, while not bad in and of themselves, nevertheless control us rather than the other way around. And the saints throughout the ages have assured us that this is the only way to wrest control from them. Our body and sensual appetites will scream in anger and distress, "You're not paying attention to me." They'll tell us that we'll surely die, or at least suffer horribly if we continue to ignore them. But that's just the spin. That's the lie. While the discomfort and desire are real, the truth is our senses won't tell us that it is over time that this discomfort and desire will lessen, and if we persevere, we will become the master of our desires and passions, not the other way around. We'll recognize true hunger rather than just wanting another piece of candy. We'll experience righteous anger at actual injustice rather than just being mad because we didn't get our way. Our desires and passions will serve us for a change. By the way, that's the way it was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve before the fall. But it's also very important to keep in mind that the end goal of the dark night is being in union with God. We enter the dark night and are willing to go through it, and His grace enables us to go through it for love of Him. We enter the dark night to come close to He who loved us before we loved Him. We enter the dark night because He is our lover and we are the beloved, and we long to be close to Him. And we do this because love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things for the sake of the beloved.